Good morning. If we did not meet yesterday, my name is Deepa Shah, and I am with the Teaching and Learning Lab. And I'll be co-facilitating this morning session with my colleague, Lourdes Aleman. And really the idea is to tell you a little bit about active learning, answer your questions about active learning, and provide you with some examples of things you might do in your classroom. So like I said, we have a little bit of audio challenges. We wanted to show you some video clips of MIT faculty using active learning in their classes. So we'll just do the best that we can in showing you some visuals, and then myself narrating. But then also, like I said, we have some examples for you to participate in as well. Okay, so I wanted to start off the session by having you think about a time when you learned how to do something, play a sport, a musical instrument, something where you were coached by some sort of facilitator. Okay, so just individually take a moment to just remember that experience. Okay, so then I want you to, hopefully that was a successful and positive experience. I want you to think about in that situation, what helps you learn, okay? So just, again, take another moment to just think about that. Which aspects of that interaction helped you learn. And now I want you to actually just discuss this experience with the neighbor. So share your experiences with each other. Share what you think helped you learn in those instances. And then after you're kind of done sharing and discussing, it would be wonderful if one of you has a device, whether that's a cell phone or a laptop, and to actually share some of the strategies that were discussed in your group on a poll everywhere. So if you've never used poll everywhere, you can text your response by texting to the number 22333. You text this code and it'll let you into the poll. Then you can text your response. Or you can just go to this URL and write your response there. So I can tell the volume has decreased, so it seems like folks' discussions have primarily ended. So if you haven't had a chance, so go ahead and take a moment to write your sentence or two, or as a group, you can write a collective sentence or two into the poll. And we're asking for a sentence because it'll capture a bit more nuance about that experience. All right, so I'm gonna generate the word cloud. So this is a word cloud that was generated. So we see things like practice, feedback, mistakes, learning, time. Okay, so these are things that can, when we have that type of coaching experience, challenging, smaller. So my hunch is that if I were to look at the sentences that this word cloud was created from, is maybe we had somebody who was breaking a task down into smaller steps for us, providing us with practice at the right level of challenge, was coaching us, maybe providing us with feedback when they saw our performance, and then maybe even tailoring the next experience. Maybe they taught you how to deal with your mistakes constructively, offered you criticism, again, probably constructive criticism as a form of feedback, and that they were able to spend a large amount of time with you, or maybe gave you practice to do while they weren't even there, where you spent a lot of time, helped, hands-on, try. So a lot of interesting themes. Encouragement. So if you attended the sessions yesterday about office hours and tutorials, a lot of similar themes coming out here. And some of the questions that we were left with is, okay, if we had a coaching experience or a one-on-one tutorial experience, there's so many wonderful things about that because our coach or our teacher or our mentor can really get to know us, get to know where we are in our development, and provide us with that appropriately challenging task, right? A task that's going to help us gain in our skill level and gain more expertise, and give us feedback when we need it so that we know that the practice that we're doing actually makes sense. So what we're going to talk about today is how we can use active learning to help us do this at scale, right? Because unfortunately, we can't provide a one-on-one tutorial experience for every student on campus for everything that they are learning, right? So recitations are one attempt to provide a smaller learning experience, a smaller cohort of students a learning experience, break them out of a large lecture classroom. So how can we do that? So today we're going to talk about active learning and how we can implement a variety of active learning methods to activate students' prior knowledge. So if you attended yesterday's session on planning a class session, we talked about how it's really important to take into account students' prior knowledge to help them connect new knowledge to existing knowledge and connect it in appropriate ways that make sense, that don't lead to misconceptions. We're also going to show you some techniques you can use to help better understand your students' problem-solving processes, right? So a tutor or a coach can give you good feedback because they can really probe into how you're approaching a task, right? So how can we do that when we have 15, 20 students? So we'll talk about some strategies for doing that. How can we provide feedback to the students and how we can help them organize their knowledge? So active learning is a tool that can help you achieve all of these things at scale, even in large lecture classes. We're not going to really be focusing on large lecture classes today, but absolutely if you are in a situation where you are teaching a large lecture class or a larger cohort, feel free to ask questions. And in general, anyone feel free to ask questions at any time. So I think it helps to get on the same page with regards to what active learning is. So this is a definition from a key paper on active learning, which we'll be talking about momentarily. But the author of the paper defines it as such. Active learning engages students in the process of learning through activities and/or discussion in class, as opposed to passively listening to an expert. It emphasizes higher order thinking and often involves group work. So I'll highlight the in-class part. We know that we get a lot of practice outside of class as well, right? So if you think about traditional instruction, we typically have content delivery happening in class, and we have practice primarily happening outside of class through homework. Homework is extremely valuable. I think we've all felt sort of the learning that has occurred just struggling through PSETs. But what many are saying is that we need to sort of change our way, right? That there's so many ways to deliver content to students actually outside of class, and we're wasting valuable in-class time where we really could be coaching and guiding and providing feedback to students if we were giving them tasks that helped us to see their thinking, helped us to understand where they are. So that in-class part is really key here. We're not saying that homework isn't still valuable, and there's definitely still times where content delivery has to happen in class, but we're talking more about mixing it up. So it's not that no content delivery can happen in class. Sometimes that's very valuable and motivating as well, but that interspersing or interleaving periods of lecture or content delivery with activities can really be beneficial for learning. So yeah, so why do it? So the Teaching and Learning Lab, we try to make sure that whatever we tell people is actually based on something around the research on how students learn or how people learn. And so there actually is a preponderance of evidence that active learning works. So I think 7 years ago, I'm looking at Janet. When I first started the Teaching and Learning Lab, we would present paper after paper after paper from this area of research or this discipline and that discipline, showing, oh, in physics it works, in oceanography it works, in biology it works. But now it's like, okay, actually, folks, we now have a meta-analysis done by Freeman and colleagues in 2014 that looks at 225 different studies done in higher education in university settings in STEM disciplines, in a huge list of STEM disciplines where either quasi-experimental methods were used or randomized controlled trials were used, where you had a control group and a treatment group that show that active learning helps students learn and it decreases failure rates in these subjects. And these were intro-level courses in STEM as well as upper-level courses in STEM. And these were techniques used either in lecture or in recitation. And there's some really interesting things that, so like I said, not only did it help to decrease failure rates, but on measures, so something called concept tests, measures of actually looking at conceptual understanding, what we see is that active learning really helps students better understand the underlying concepts. So you've probably seen this before, where students can pattern match and they can plug and chug and they can get the right answer. And in fact, if tests aren't well designed, they can still do well on tests, right? And they can walk out of a classroom with an A and still not really get the fundamentals, not really understand the concepts. There's some a video we're not going to show, but there's a video that you can watch of a professor at Harvard, Eric Mazur, who basically realized this, that his students at Harvard, they were doing just fine in his class. They were getting A's, they were leaving that class, and they were passing, but they did not actually get the underlying concepts. So he started administering a concept test to his students called the Force Concept Inventory, which asked them about basic mechanics principles. And the students, while they were getting an A in the class, were not doing well on that exam. And he was astonished. And he said he used to do the traditional lecture method. He said, I need to change something about the way I teach, because my students, they can do well on my exams, but they are not getting these fundamental concepts. So he really changed his whole approach to teaching and made it more active. And he was actually, I think, a very influential leader sort of in the field and getting more faculty on board with active learning. But then this Freeman paper was also sort of a huge kind of game changer. So at least what I have observed with faculty on campus is there's more and more use of active learning in the classroom. Still many traditional teaching methods used as well. But that particularly with new faculty, we do new faculty trainings. When new faculty come in, we used to have to tell them what active learning was, but now they already know, and they have more questions about just how do I actually do it. So it's just something to be aware of, that things have changed a lot, and that's, I think, going to be the continuing trend. All of that said, many people still have concerns about active learning and how they're going to use it. And I think there's also some really common misconceptions about active learning. So one very common misconception about active learning is that it has to be hands-on. So this is, I think, a pretty major misconception, that it has to be hands-on. The most important thing about active learning is that it should be minds-on, that the students are actively engaging with the material. So I know that myself as a student, and I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we've all sat through lectures at times where we're really just kind of like there, and we're taking the notes, and we may or may not be actually actively processing, actively following along with the professor. Maybe we were tired that morning, maybe we're thinking about other things, but again, we'll be introducing you today to some techniques to take what could be a passive experience and just tweak it slightly so that it can be more minds-on. But it doesn't mean that you have to have fancy materials or do crazy demonstrations, or, all those things are great too. It's okay to be hands-on, but it's not necessary. Okay. And this is one of the videos I'm just going to skip for now, because it would just show us a classroom where they're doing pencil, paper, kind of, the students are working problems in class, responding on a student response system with their answers, so the faculty can see how they're doing. When you use a student response system, who has used some sort of student response system? A clicker, pull everywhere. Okay, so many of you. So you know that the instructor can get feedback from that technology and respond appropriately. So we'll be actually doing an activity later where I'm going to not so much use it as an opportunity to show you the technology, that's a sort of added aside, but how, like, some best practices for how to actually implement that activity in order to give you feedback, give students feedback, and sort of how to decide what to do next. Okay. All right, another common misconception is that active learning has to be collaborative. So Scott Freeman's definition says that often active learning involves collaboration, but it does not have to always involve collaboration, okay? So one thing to keep in mind, I think, is that not everybody wants to be collaborative all the time. So there are preliminary, I would say, there's preliminary evidence that if implemented well, collaboration can increase the benefits of an active learning experience. But it is not always necessary for everything to be collaborative. And in fact, we want to make sure that we give students the opportunity to actively engage individually first, right? We want students to think on their own first before they start doing something with a partner or a peer, right? So there are some pros and cons of that collaboration. What have been your experiences with collaborative active learning? Or what are some of the concerns that you have, or some of the advantages you see to it? Yes?
I think, like you said, the most important thing is to like think independently first before you collaborate, because otherwise it's like you're just taking somebody else's idea. Like, for instance, on a problem set, if you're working in a group and you haven't seen a problem set or thought about it beforehand, and you come together as a group and somebody else has, it's like you're just taking what they're saying and you're like, okay, let me try to understand what they're saying, versus thinking about like, oh, how does what they're saying apply to the question? Is it the right answer? Is it the right answer? Is this the right way to think about it?
Yeah, so it's almost like you're, and it's totally unintentional on the part of the person who hasn't had time to think about it, right? So it's not even that they're trying to be a slacker and just like copy off of their friends. I just didn't get a chance to think about it, and because you did it faster, like all of a sudden I'm just like catching up, and I'm not getting that benefit of sort of activating my own knowledge and trying to explain these concepts to myself and making those connections. So for being our brave first respondent, you get a prize. All right, over here.
So yeah, on following on from that, maybe the argument can be made that collaborative learning is always less active than individual learning.
So can you clarify what you mean by that?
So that if you have to struggle with it by yourself, you'll be drawing upon more of your faculties and resources, and that will be more likely to deepen the learning, I think, than having others, participate in solving the problem.
Okay. Okay, so no, I think that's perfectly valid. So can anyone think though of, are there any benefits? What are some of the possible benefits of that collaborative experience? Yes.
Well, like your resource, like maybe you're using more of your resources if you're working individually, but if you have a group, then your resource pool is larger. So like maybe one person really remembers a certain aspect of it, somebody else has all the equations memorized. Like you could, I don't know, that would be a successful.
So, and maybe to elaborate on that, what you're alluding to is that perhaps there could be some peer teaching going on. So if that, in that teaching experience, if done well, can be beneficial for the teacher and the learner, just like all of a sudden this peer is your tutor and you are the tutee. So right, if done well, if it's not just, hey, just write it down, okay, is this equation. That's not teaching, right? So that's a valid point. What else? Yes.
I think sometimes when you're working on a big problem alone, you're more likely to check out and just be like, I don't know how to get there. I don't know the answer. But if you're working with someone else who gives you like a small piece of how to move forward, that can help you like be more patient with the whole process.
Okay, so so perhaps it's somewhat motivational to actually have that peer. So I tend to run longer distances with a peer than I will on my own. Yeah. Yes.
People can bring different perspectives and approaches to problem solving, and sometimes those can mesh really well together. A way that someone else sees the problem could help you understand it more.
Yeah, great. Different perspectives, yes.
I think just the act of communicating, even if you're not getting anything from the other person, just talking to someone, saying things out loud. Like sometimes you ask a question and you realize the answer to it as soon as you say it out loud, but it wasn't when you were thinking about it, you didn't have the answer.
Yeah. So really, to paraphrase what you say, this idea of explaining to somebody else how you're doing it, and maybe you were stuck, but then now you're talking through it, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute, the light bulb goes off, right? So it's just another way of processing the information. Okay, these are all great and valid points. So one tool that we'll be introducing and using later is this idea of think, pair, and then sometimes there's a maybe a larger group share out, but this idea of, it's really important not to skip this step, I think, to give students some time to think on their own and struggle and just get as far as they can before they start doing this pair. And the benefits of this pair, as we've heard, is things like different perspectives, peer teaching opportunities, right? And also it's also another way to scale feedback. Okay, so as you're discussing your different perspectives, perhaps there are multiple valid approaches to solving that problem. We encounter those, especially as we move into upper level classes, right? But also by sharing our different perspectives, by articulating our thinking, we might also uncover some either deficiencies in understandings in our peers, or maybe they applied the right formula but for the wrong reasons. So it's also an opportunity to get some feedback about our thinking. So you're sharing your thinking with your peer, you get to hear how they approach it, how they think about it, and then you can kind of discuss and debate, like, are both approaches valid? You can start thinking about limiting cases. So there's so many positive things that can come out of those conversations if people are well prepared and sort of willing to engage in that activity. Okay. All right. So again, it doesn't always have to be collaborative. Many benefits of being collaborative. And I say the reason I always stress that it doesn't always have to be collaborative is I do think there are some sort of personal preferences when it comes to collaboration. And I think it's good to force students outside of their comfort zone. But then I think it's also good to kind of cut them a break every now and then, because it can be really sort of resource intensive for some people. Not everybody is very extroverted. Not everybody, wants to always be talking with somebody. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. All right, requires technology. I am going to show you this video, even though there is no audio. I'm going to describe to you what you will see in the video, and then you can just see it happening in the video. So one common misconception is that active learning has to require technology. I fed that misconception by having you use technology earlier. I had you use that technology because it does kind of help in a large group like this. But again, it is definitely not necessary. So this video clip that you're going to see, but not here, is Professor Jeff Gore, and oops, let me do this. Professor Jeff Gore, who teaches a systems biology class here on campus. And I believe his class size is, I would say, is a medium-sized class. What? I have audio. Oh my goodness, I don't need to tell you. I'm still going to tell you what you're going to see a little bit. So systems biology class, Jeff Gore, and he does not use technology. He actually writes his question on the board as you're starting to see, and I'll start it over from the beginning and send it to widescreen. And then he has his students vote using a very low-tech means of colored cards. Has anybody been in Jeff Gore's class by any chance? Okay. Any local experts?
And we're going to just do a few different limits. So we want to maybe go through these quickly. I'll give you just 10 seconds to prepare your card. All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we're pretty good. Not all right. So I'd say a majority, at least, of the group is saying that in this case, it's going to, the fraction bound should go to 0. And intuitively, why should that be? So a little bit louder. You have nothing to bind. Yeah, right. So if there's no S around at all, then you shouldn't have much of this complex, right? And so then, but you still have some enzymes, right? So this thing, yeah, indeed, this thing should go to 0, right? And that kind of makes sense, all right? And similarly,
so he's reviewing Michaelis-Menten kinetics. Some of you are probably familiar with that. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other things that you saw in that video in a little bit. But again, so looking at colored cards across the audience is perhaps not as accurate as getting a histogram from Socrative or Turning Technologies or what have you. But you can still get a pretty good sense. Even if I use colored index cards in here, I would still be able to get a pretty good sense if the majority, 60% or more, were all of the same. I could probably visually tell that pretty well. I've seen faculty actually use low-tech means even in 400 student lecture halls. So you could do colored cards like Jeff Gore. You can also do this. I've seen faculty just pick choice 1, 2, 3, or 4, and just hold it up in front of you. And again, in large lecture lecture halls have had faculty at least do a rough approximation of are people getting it or not. And again, we'll talk about this later about what do we do next once we see sort of that histogram technology enabled or not. Another common misconception about active learning is like, well, I teach a lab, therefore it is active. But that is not always the case. So labs are not necessarily cognitively active, okay? So when we talk about active learning does not have to be hands-on, and just because something is hands-on does not necessarily make it active. So on this chart that you see on the screen, on the vertical axis, we're looking at behavioral activity. So that's like doing stuff, highlighting, building something, putting together an apparatus, running a column, behavioral activity. On the horizontal axis is cognitive activity, okay? So low behavioral, low cognitive is sort of like classic zoned out student in a large lecture hall, right? So they're not really doing much and they're not thinking much, okay? So low behavioral activity, but high cognitive activity. So, you can maybe critique Jeff Gore's questions, but he's reviewing Michaelis-Menten kinetics, and he's saying we're doing this really quickly, but I want you to think about these limiting cases. So those students you could argue that many of them are high in their cognitive activity. They're not really like doing much. They're still sitting in their seat. They're just thinking about these limiting cases. High behavioral activity, below cognitive activity is sort of the classic, here's a step-by-step protocol. Student comes into lab. They're just mechanically kind of going through the steps. They're not really thinking about why am I doing these steps. They're just trying to get everyone's working towards the same end result. Everyone's doing that. They're just, again, like I said, just mixing reagents or what have you, not really thinking about it. So what we really might like to see in a lab course is high behavior activity. Okay, again, you can argue somewhat automatic in most labs, but high cognitive activity. So why am I performing the separation like this? What characteristics about the reagents require this type of separation method? What if I had these other kinds of reagents? Really getting students to think through that lab protocol in a much more active way. So we'll talk a little bit later about ways we can get students to engage in some of those explanations in a laboratory class. Okay. I'm so glad I have audio because this is the best video that I wanted to show you. Okay, another common misconception about active learning that can make it really intimidating to implement. My students won't want to do it. And I think particularly when you're a TA and your students are maybe like a couple years younger than you feel like you can't boss them around, but you can. And so my students won't want to do it. It is true that students will resist active learning. And if you talk to is there any Teal TAs in the room? Teal has their own training, but are you guys familiar with what Teal is? So Teal, and if you didn't go to undergrad here, there's no reason you would know what it is. It's an acronym, but you will hear like legends about Teal. Technology-enabled active learning. So the intro physics courses have been converted to an active format so it is lecture interspersed with problem solving in class. When it was first implemented, the students they didn't riot in a very physical way, but there was much outwardly expressed resistance to Teal, even like engaging alumni to call the institution, to call like administration to try to kill Teal. Now it's true that there were some things in the early days of Teal, it wasn't quite yet smoothed out yet, and it wasn't the best implementation of active learning at the start. But the students really resisted because they were not used to it. So I think this video that you're about to watch talks a little bit about that struggle, or that students kind of have to go through if they've never been taught in an active format. It is a change. You are asking them to think all of a sudden. They can't just come into class and be lazy. And so it's kind of tiring for them, and so they sometimes will complain. But there are simple things you can do to get over that resistance. And so this faculty member will talk a little bit about what you can do to get over that resistance. And you'll also hear from one or two students in his class about how, like, at first didn't love it, now it is going better. So that is the video.
So there are a couple challenges that you need to think about when you're using this approach. One is it's important to explain to the students what's going on. If you just start doing this and say this is what we're going to do and don't tell the students why you're going to do it, that's problematic. I think it's important to think of the students as partners, explain what's going on. They're much more likely to buy into it and maybe get used to the new approach. One of the things I do is I present some data because it's MIT and students are persuaded by data. And what the data says is that generally the more active a learning exercise, the more that students learn. And there's some really good data in the literature that shows that. So I explain to students that the reason I'm doing this is to increase their level of understanding, especially at the conceptual level, as opposed to the analytic level of just doing a problem using the equations.
I've never had a recitation like this before. Actually working on problems with everybody else and kind of going through it and struggling through it, but eventually understanding a lot better what was done in lecture through, I guess, a more hands-on approach.
All right, so I'm going to stop the video there. But so what Professor Hall said is he explains to his students, he realized it's really important to explain to them why he is doing what he is doing, right? So I'm not just, asking you questions to put you on the spot and intimidate you, but I'm doing this so that I'm making sure that you're actively thinking about these things. Okay. So I have a question for the audience, because I know that some people are experienced TAs in the audience. Has anyone tried to do active learning, and are you willing to share your struggles and your successes with the group? Because I think that could be really valuable to hear from a peer. In the back, Piotr? Yeah, thank you.
Math graduate student, and about a year ago, maybe a bit less, I started doing my recitations in the way that I paired up students, or they paired up themselves and got to blackboards and solved problems. And one of the things that suddenly were much better is that I actually started to know what students know and what they don't, so I could give precise feedback. And I also got quite a bit of positive feedback from the students who like this format of class. And it's been going on well so far.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you did this in math, is my understanding that the culture in math recitations, though, this is not typical. What you're doing, having this active collaborative format, is not typical. So how did you get started, and did the students sort of take it up right away, or was there a bit of a challenge at first?
Well, actually, in the last class, the instructor asked everybody to do this. So, and he was also using active learning techniques in the lecture. So this was like something class-wide. In the previous one, at first students felt kind of, kind of awkward, but at first they went in bigger groups, 3 or 4, and somehow they quickly cached it. I didn't have any really problems with that transition.
Okay, great. So yeah, it definitely helps if lecture is already active or they've previously experienced active learning. That can help a lot. And this idea again that it helped you to see, it helped to illuminate for you their problem-solving process and give you better feedback. There were a couple other hands raised. Do you mind sharing?
Yeah. So I ran part of a large course 6 class in active learning, so it was in parallel with the main lectures. And so the students had to buy into it, so it helped that they were already interested in that. About halfway through term, I switched to a much more active style, so I was writing active more. And basically just told students like, this is new for me, it's gonna be new for you, let me know what works or not. And after 1 or 2 times, they gave me like, oh, that really doesn't work. And I'm like, sorry, how about this? And then it started working out. So they got used to, at the end of every class, just giving me a little bit of feedback. That was very helpful and very quickly when everyone was doing it. They were way more happy than before.
So, so this is great. So soliciting feedback on your teaching techniques and being willing to take them into consideration and adjusting. How did you actually have them give you feedback? Did they write it on a piece of paper, or did they just approach you and?
At that point, they were very comfortable with me, so they just came up after class. One student in particular came back like basically after every class. I was like, I like that. I didn't like this. Yeah.
And can you just share one technique that you used that you think worked particularly well?
Yeah, this one's a little bit tricky because most of them knew the concepts that we're going to get to, but try to build, especially in engineering, the concepts from the ground up. So here's our problem. What's like the first approach that we could try? Okay, why doesn't it work? How can we tweak it? And then like try to really solicit students' ideas about that. And often they know where I'm going with it, and so they'll bring it back. But it really helps motivate like really small details that are hard to just understand when you first see it, but when you build a solution, it's like, oh yeah, we need that.
Mm-hmm. So it was really helping them understand those pieces of the problem-solving process. Great. So there was another hand over here, someone who had used active learning, maybe in the back. Sorry, I don't know who was first.
Back in college, I was teaching a class on biochemistry. So what we did was, it's advanced biochem, so we would not really be going through like textbooks and stuff. We'd be doing talking about papers and things like that, and it gets a little dense because students don't really, might have a hard time understanding the whole logic of the paper. So when I taught the class, I didn't want to repeat what the professors taught or said. So I broke down each paper into like figures. Basically pulled all the figures from the paper, and then we go through papers one figure at a time, and then I'll list out questions and have multiple choice questions, and then we'll work through them together slide by slide like that, and then so there's some kind of dynamic active learning going on, and then after each slide I'd have an overall roadmap of where the paper or where these figures are leading. So after each slide of the discussion, we would fill in the blanks of that roadmap so that the students know that, hey, after I get the answer, it's not the end, right? We're actually building towards something. And then they have a sense of satisfaction, and then they would be able to visualize what they did and what they accomplished through the roadmap.
Awesome. Yeah, so you're not only helping them understand pieces of it, but then helping really organize their knowledge too. Great. Up here?
So not as a TA, but as a tutor, what I did a lot was, so I tutored Orgo, and so I would go through a problem on the board, or maybe one or two, and then explain it as thoroughly as I can, and then kind of switch roles, and so they would then teach me a new question, a new mechanism. I would literally sit down, blank, not trying to look like them when they're confused, but kind of be them for a second and give them a sense of superiority, even if they don't know what they're doing. So I had a word that I used, which was intervene. So I would literally sit there. If they were doing the whole mechanism wrong, I would just watch them do it wrong. And then until they said, okay, intervene, I wouldn't say anything. So it kind of allowed them to see exactly where they're going wrong, and kind of give them an opportunity to explain what it is that they have mastered since we've been tutoring.
Cool. There was a couple other hands. I know I'm not going in order of how people actually raise their hand. Yes.
Yeah, so when I TA'd as an undergrad, actually our classes were actually built around the idea of active learning. So what we did is we created little tables. And initially they'd be assigned tables. I would just say, these names are going to sit here, these names are going to sit here, which always was really awkward for them because they're like, oh, I have a friend in the class and I want to sit with them. We're like, no, we're encouraging you to interact with different people, and it switched every exam. So after an exam, we would kind of switch it around. Sometimes strategically, if we had, a table of really strong people, we might try and interdisperse them with the weaker groups. But surprisingly, we didn't have a lot of pushback because, again, our classrooms were built this way. But the most important thing I realized, going through active learning was trying to build some sort of community between the students. and that could sometimes be really difficult. So we had a 15-minute, the first couple of weeks we had a 15-minute, quote-unquote social hour. It was a 2-hour discussion, so we had plenty of time to do that. And I'd say, we're just going to talk about a topic today, and we're going to talk about our favorite food. And that, for the first couple of weeks, kind of broke the ice. And then it became much easier for them to criticize each other, because, arguing over pizza is what's your favorite topping is not intimidating, but it's intimidating to argue over what you think the best, way to approach a chemical problem is.
Yeah.
So I found that really helped them actually be willing to challenge each other in good, constructive ways.
Great. So thank you for bringing up a really great point, and a side benefit of active learning is it can really help to create community. So yes, it helps if you have community in place to facilitate active learning, but I think active learning itself, it's can go back and help strengthen that feeling of community. So this idea of thinking about ways early in the term to help students to get to know each other and to get comfortable with each other so that they will be more comfortable sharing feedback and then also receiving the feedback, right? Not get defensive about somebody sort of what might be perceived as criticism if it feels like it's coming from a stranger. But I think that there's also this, and this has been reported in the literature, there's also this benefit though of by letting students, by allowing people to talk to each other, they can actually get to know each other. It sort of humanizes the whole classroom experience, and hopefully they can become a resource for each other even outside of class, right? So we know that students will frequently work on P-sets in groups, but maybe this will open up, by, even though it was kind of forced that you were switching the seating arrangement, by getting to know more students in the class, they have sort of more resources to go to outside of class and might be more comfortable approaching a different peer. Also, the other thing I wanted to highlight that you talked about after an exam, maybe based on the exam performance, breaking up the groups. So something that Eric Mazur and others have seen is that, you could imagine if you have two very confused students sharing strategies with each other might not be the best situation, right? But if you can pair, a student that does have the tools in their toolbox and then the student that doesn't quite yet have those tools in their toolbox together, that peer teaching that someone else referred to earlier, that peer teaching can be much more beneficial. So if you have that insight, you can think about doing that. And if you make it sort of part of the routine, after every exam, we switch it up. We're going to be talking to somebody different, then, which is true and valid, then there's sort of no big deal about doing that. So again, the more you can sort of routinize things, then it just doesn't feel as weird, and they get more used to it. So thank you so much for sharing all those wonderful examples. I have examples for you too. I'm going to keep my comments brief because I think your examples were so wonderful. I also have prizes that I forgot to give out. So maybe while you guys are working on your activity, I will circulate around with some prizes, which we have sets of Plickr cards, which I will demonstrate in a moment, and some other things. But thank you so much for sharing. That was wonderful. Okay, and then our last misconception before we go into some examples is that active learning takes a lot of time to prepare and do. So all of those folks that shared in the audience, wonderful. You can ask them about how much time it took them to prepare and do. We are going to try to show you some quick things that are just augmentations of things that you're already doing that you can use as active learning opportunities. So both doesn't take a lot of time for you to prepare and doesn't necessarily take up too much more time of your class. One thing that I will point out about this tension about time, sure, you can probably lecture and cover more content in 50 minutes than if it was, an interactive session where you had 2 or 3 activities that took up a total of 25 minutes. Absolutely, you can quote unquote cover more content by lecturing. The question I always have in response to that is, well, how much did the students actually learn, right? It goes back to learning is what we want to maximize, not the words coming out of our mouths as facilitators and lecturers. All right, so if you think about a class session, and if you were here at yesterday's session about planning a class session, you've already seen this, but just to get everybody up to speed, if you think about a class session, whether it's recitation or even a lecture, you can break it down into kind of 4 chunks. There's some sort of opener, some articulations of goals for the day, or an outline. So here are our goals. The chunk of the session, the meat of the session, the stuff that you're gonna do, that the students are gonna do, the things that are gonna help them achieve their goals. So for recitation, primarily practice and feedback. And then some sort of closing or summary where hopefully we can remember to help students organize their knowledge. So what I'm going to do for the next 15 minutes or so is show you some quick examples that you can use to help students connect to their prior knowledge and provide them with practice and feedback. And some of them you can actually also use as a way to summarize the session. Okay. So one really basic and I think easy to implement, no fancy tools required, is instead of summarizing this past week's lectures for your students, instead, and tell them while you're doing it, instead have them take a moment and try to recall from their own memory the major topics presented in lecture this week, okay? So again, if you were at the session yesterday, we talked about this idea of retrieval. The more we retrieve things from our brain, the more retrievable they are in the future. And of course, after the students have done this, it would be nice for you to fill in any gaps. So, if you have a class of 10, 15, 20 students, you give them a minute or two to do this. Then you say, okay, who can just call out one major topic, make a list on the board, and then fill in any gaps. You could also, another variation I've seen TAs do of this activity is after giving everybody a moment to jot these down, is just call on one student to provide the whole list. Or I've even seen TAs pre-assign the activity. So every week a different student is going to have to summarize that week's lectures. Okay, and so let's just sign up. On the first day of recitation, we sign up, and you know what week you'll be doing this, so you can be sort of well prepared for that week. So different ways to do that. Another option that's pretty quick, you could use to open up your session and to assess students' prior knowledge, is to ask them a multiple choice question. So that the gentleman in the back mentioned that he had multiple choice questions about the figures in the paper. You can use a multiple choice question to probe students' misconceptions or misunderstandings about an important concept from the week. So how might we do that? So you could, again, pose the question to students. You can write it on the board. You can have it on a slide. And just like Jeff Gore did, he asked them, okay, take a minute, commit to an answer, and then vote. So they can vote, low tech or high tech. And then you can get a sense of the room. So if you vote and the majority get it right, there is no reason to belabor it, right? So if we vote and 85% of the class gets it right, so Jeff Gore in the video, he said, okay, it looks like most people got it right. Can somebody please explain to me? So there's not going to be enough clicker cards for everyone, so just kind of, if every 2 or 3 people have one, you're good. So if the majority got it right, he said, okay, so can somebody tell me why? Why was it A? So you make sure that everybody is clear, that everybody gets feedback, if you will, on why the right answer is correct, and then you move on, okay? So here's what we're going to pretend. We're going to pretend that I asked you this question, and I gave you the opportunity to think about it individually, and then I already gave you one opportunity to vote. Okay, so let's just pretend that you've already voted once, and let's pretend that it was only about 50% of the class that got the question right. Okay, so in that case, if that happens to you, only half your class gets the question right, it would be beneficial to have them talk to a peer, share their thinking, say, oh, you know what did you answer? You answered B, well, I answered A. Why'd you answer B? She tells me why she answered B. I tell her why I answered A. And then you allow your students, hey, after you talk to your peer, you can change your answer, okay? And so often what you see when you do that is that the histogram will shift to more students getting the correct answer, right? So that peer teaching typically will benefit them. There will be cases where, again, 2 confused students are still confused afterwards. But we generally say that if, like 50 to 60% are getting it right, it is worth doing that collaborative activity, the pair part of it. If the vast majority, like 75% or above are getting it right, you can do what Jeff Gore did in the video, ask for the correct response, ask for the reason behind it, and move on. But sort of below sort of 60% is worth doing the peer activity, unless unless it's like really low, right? So if it's only 10, 15, 20% got it right, again, you'll just have a bunch of confused people talking to confused people. It's better that you, as the local expert, provide some clarification in that case. In all cases, it's good just to make sure everybody is clear on the correct answer and why the correct answer is correct. So I want you to pretend like you thought about it. Now you're going to do the pair activity, where you're going to discuss what you think the right answer is, and you're going to pair up with somebody who has a Plickr card. And then when I ask you to vote, the way the Plickr cards work, if I'm going to just borrow yours for a second, is that along the sides of the card are A, B, C, and D. So when you're ready to vote, you orient your card so that the correct answer, or the answer you want to vote for, is readable, if you will, if you were reading it out of a textbook, right? So it's not upside down, it's not sideways. It's the way you would read it in a textbook. And then I have an app on my phone that basically does image analysis. Okay? So take 1 minute to discuss with the neighbor, and then you're going to vote by holding it up. You guys ready to vote? Okay. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so what's pretty cool is that on my phone, so first of all, it won't double count cards. They are unique cards. The other cool thing is that because no two are alike, you can't really tell what your peer is voting for. I mean, sure, if you're close enough to read it, you know, you can read it. In this case, only the instructor needs to have technology. So if you're not comfortable, like if you want to use some sort of classroom response system, but you're not comfortable with your students having devices out, or if they don't have devices available, it's a free app. It's called Plickers. I'll write it on the board because I'm not sure if it's anywhere else. But they're called Plickers. Okay, and I could see how many people had responded, and so if you know your class size, you know roughly, you know, when everybody has voted. It can register multiple cards at one time. Even from this distance, I could capture like 12 cards at one time. So it didn't I didn't have to walk up and down the aisles or anything like that. So to wrap up the demonstration, okay, so what I am seeing is that the vast majority of the class chose option B. Would somebody like to explain to the rest of the class why they chose option B and why they think it is correct? Sure, thank you.
So I thought it was B because the plant would take carbon dioxide out of air and use that to make its long carbon chains that would.
Yes, absolutely. So that is absolutely correct, that if you think about what we've learned all of our lives about photosynthesis, and if we're thinking about only dry biomass, so excluding water, that is carbon dioxide that contributes to most of the mass that we have in plants and in trees. What's really interesting is that this is one of those really common and persistent misconceptions that people hold about photosynthesis. And in fact, there's a really entertaining video that you can watch of MIT graduates and Harvard graduates at graduation being asked a very similar question and being presented with a large tree branch and being asked this question. And it is amazing the things they say that are just wrong. So that just points to a whole other thing. But that, again, the conceptual understanding piece, really being left behind sometimes. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is, instead of me presenting you a bunch of activities, what we have done is we have created a handout that has 8 activities on it. Now, these activities are applied to a specific discipline. We don't expect that you would use the activity straight up because it's not your discipline. But take a look at the handout, read through the different examples, And think about which ones resonate with you. Like which, it's sort of a commitment exercise. Which would you be likely to use? Because you have to use something that you're comfortable using. And which do you think would work for your discipline? If you have any questions as you read through the handout, feel free to raise your hand and I can come by and answer your question if you don't understand something about the handout. But I want you to take a few minutes on your own to look at the handout, make some commitments, and then in a few minutes I'm going to ask you to discuss with a partner. I just want to bring you back together for one moment because we had a really great question about closers. So because I skipped through some of the slides, I didn't talk about if there is a difference between active openers versus active closers. So there isn't necessarily a difference, but the idea with a closing is that we could use the activity as a way to summarize some body of knowledge. So some could be used interchangeably. So for example, this example, depending on what the sequence of the class has been so far, you could use it as an opener. So maybe in an orgo class, you've been talking about these two different synthetic routes. Maybe you want to open the session with this activity to sort of see what students have taken away so far. Or if you're going to discuss these more in detail in the recitation, you could close with this to make sure that they sort of get the similarities and differences relevant to these two different reactions. Similarly, you could open your session with a more open-ended question. Okay, so far we've seen several examples of this phenomena already. What were they and what conclusions did we draw about them? Again, that might make sense to do at the beginning of the session. It might make sense to do at the end, sort of depending on what else you have planned. Similarly, asking, we've been working with these kinds of circuits now for the week. Let's make sure we understand all of these different characteristics of the circuit, that we understand what's going to happen to all these different parameters. That could be a way to summarize. But if you're perhaps doing exam review, this recitation section, it could be somewhere else. It doesn't have to be the closing. But the idea with closings generally being that you're helping the students summarize some pieces of knowledge. So it could be just summarizing knowledge from the week. It could be summarizing knowledge from multiple weeks. But this idea of helping them build connections, how is X related to Y? Otherwise, to a novice, right, you guys know your fields very, very well, so you know how things are connected. A novice can't necessarily draw those connections, so they feel like, I'm learning this thing, I'm learning that thing, I'm learning that thing, I'm learning that thing. They don't know that those things are potentially related, or that perhaps they should be comparing and contrasting them, or they should be looking for common themes amongst them. So the idea with a closing is that we're gonna help them kind of build that knowledge organization. Okay. All right, so we have built in a break for you.